Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Is affordability message the solution to energy unaffordability? We'll wait and give people time to join. But for those of you who I don't know, or if this is your first time joining a Re.Climate event, my name is Amber Bennett, and I am the Executive Director of Re.Climate. Re.Climate is dedicated to the research and practice of climate change communications and engagement. We are a center based at Carleton University, and we work with leaders and organizations across the country to increase public understanding of climate change impacts and solutions, as well as increase support. We develop resources, such as some of the materials that will be covered today. And we also provide training, we convene conversations in communities of practice, and we offer a range of strategic services. So for those of you who are just joining us, welcome. You are at the webinar, Is Affordability Messaging the Answer to Energy Unaffordability? And I am joining you today from Calgary, which is based in the traditional territories of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani nations, and the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, and Métis Nation 3. I have lived here for a number of decades and am grateful to raise my family here. And I am acutely aware that that has come at a cost of the people who have been here for thousands of years, and also the animals and the nature that we use. So I will give you time to join, but I invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself. Please let us know where you're joining from. We're expecting over 600, or we have about 680 people registered for today. And I think that shows the importance of this conversation in this moment right now. Just in terms of some of the housekeeping that we have, we are recording today's webinar. We will make available that recording as well as the presentations after the webinar. We do not monitor the chat for questions. We do encourage you to use the chat. We like it's nice, it's lively, but we use the Q&A function for asking questions. And so please place your questions there, and we'll do our best to answer those later on in the session. So we have just over an hour and 15 minutes together. We will start with some presentations, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about that. And then we'll try our best to answer questions in live time. So I can see that people are popping into the chat, so please introduce yourself, and we'll get started very, very shortly. I think that the way that we've asked this question probably suggests what how we're thinking about it. Is affordability messaging the solution to energy unaffordability? So maybe spoiler alert, we're probably you probably know where we're going with this, but I think over the next hour, we're going to challenge a little bit the notion that shifting the hearts and the minds and the intentions of Canadians really comes down to the perfect word or the perfect language. It's far more complicated than that, and I think that I'm really excited to be here with Jim Stanford and Louise Comeau, and give space and time for the thinking and the research that they've done, which has fundamentally shifted, I think, how I'm understanding this question. And also, I think it provides some really clear direction for how we move forward. Obviously, this is coming at a time in which Canadians are on the brink of deciding our future and the leadership of this country. A snap election is imminent, and affordability has been the top issue for Canadians over the last number of years. And Jim's work will dig a little bit more into what's underneath of the affordability crisis, what's underneath of the inflation that Canadians are feeling within their communities and their homes and their lives. And then the work that Louise will be presenting on will help provide some insights into how we might have a conversation that better connects with where people are at and better responds to some of the ways in which they're evaluating the conversation around climate and energy and the solutions that we would like to talk about. So once again, we'll have some time for discussion, and we'll be using the Q&A function to respond to your questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two speakers. The first, I'm very pleased to say that we have Jim Stanford joining us. He's an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work and one of Canada's best-known economic commentators. He's served for over 20 years as an economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He's quoted frequently, and even more frequently these days, in print and broadcast media, including today on the implications of U.S. tariffs. He writes a regular column for the Toronto Star and is a Harold Innis Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University. He is one of the co-authors of a new report called Counting Costs, which is the report that he'll be sharing today. And it's a detailed review on the exploration of how a spike in global oil prices was the biggest single factor setting off inflation. And he'll also walk us through some of the ways in which we can protect Canadians in the future. And our second speaker is Dr. Louise Comeau. She is a senior advisor at Re.Climate, which is Carleton University Centre for Climate Change Communications. She's also a member of the Federal Net Zero Advisory Body. She has over 30 years experience in climate change policy, communications, and solutions related to advocacy and programming. She holds a doctorate in environmental management focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from the University of New Brunswick. The report and the research that Louise will be sharing with us is Building a Social Mandate for Climate Action, a Playbook for Communicating Affordability. And it outlines a new way to think about how we communicate about affordability based on her work and research into public perception and willingness to engage with energy efficient technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles. So great. We've got a superstar cast here. So without further ado, Jim, I'm going to hand it over to you to present on your work, and thank you for joining us.
Amber, thank you very much, and Louise and the whole team at Re.Climate. It's a great honor for me and a great opportunity for our Center for Future Work to partner with you and your network and talk about not just what are the facts and figures. That's my role. I'm the economist. I'm never happier than when I've buried myself in a spreadsheet and figuring out how all the numbers fit together. But that doesn't mean I'm good at communicating the ideas and getting people to help wrap their minds around them. So a great opportunity to partner with Re.Climate and the very innovative work you're doing. This report that I'll summarize today was kind of a forensic exercise, if you like. It was looking back at the affordability challenges that Canadians have experienced the last 3 or 4 years. And Amber, as you pointed out, until recently, they dominated the discourse in Canada about economics and politics and climate. So then Donald Trump came along, of course, so now something else dominates the discourse, but the affordability issues are still very much front and center. And so this is a report to look back and ask, what happened? How did this come about? What was the source of these affordability challenges? So I kind of feel like someone who works for the Transportation Safety Board is this group in Canada that investigates a plane crash when it happens, and they go out and pour through the wreckage and they try to come up with what happened. And try to prevent the disaster from happening again. And that's kind of what we're doing on the economics here, to figure out what went wrong and make sure that we understand what happened and we're blaming the right people for it or the right forces for it, rather than getting sidetracked down some rabbit holes, looking at scapegoats that actually were not the problem. I'm going to share some slides as we go through here, and then obviously pass it to Louise, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Our report is called Counting the Costs, the impact of the oil price shock for Canadian consumers and workers. I do want to give credit to my co-author on the report, Aaron Weir, who's a great economist. I was very glad to work with him. And this report and everything we do at the Center for Future Work is open access at our website. And of course, you're welcome to join the conversation on social media. I refuse to put the X up there. I don't drive a Tesla, and I won't put the X up there, but we're still online there and on the other platforms as well. We've also got a special website that we've created, falseprofits.ca, for this report and others in a series where we're going to be looking at how fossil fuel prices and profits have undermined the living standards of Canadians in different ways. And this report is the first in that series. The key messages to take away from this, first of all, this is a bit of a pedagogical exercise, an opportunity to explain to Canadians how oil prices get set. I don't think people understand that very well and understand how ephemeral the whole process is that determines how much we pay for gasoline and heating oil and natural gas and everything else. Show that price spike that occurred in 2022, that was the most important source of the inflationary upsurge after the pandemic, was not the result of natural or efficient market forces like supply and demand. There was something else going on there. Then we'll add up the costs of that oil price spike as they flowed through to Canadian workers and consumers and show what it all added up. We'll follow the money and show that money ended up somewhere. We paid for it out of our pockets, and guess where it went? You get 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. Record profits for the oil and gas industry. And then some policy conclusions about how we protect ourselves against this kind of episode happening again in the future. And it will happen again, especially with Donald Trump running amok and all of the chaos that we're seeing in economics, in finance, in geopolitics. There is no doubt that this will happen again. So we, just like the Transportation Safety Board, we'd better figure out what happened and try and stop it from happening again. Of course, affordability has been a big concern of Canadians with the upsurge in inflation and the challenges that families have had to pay their monthly bills. And the petroleum industry has jumped right in to try and take advantage of that, to try and divert people's fear and uncertainty and anger about that, and use it against anything to do with climate or anything to do with regulations on what the oil and gas sector can and cannot do. And we're seeing that big time right now, of course, with the oil and gas industry's response to the Trump tariff war. They've tried to weaponize the concerns that Canadians have over affordability and paying the bills. And honestly, this is the most painful irony. It is their own products and their own behavior that were the biggest single factor behind those affordability concerns since the pandemic. So for them to stand up and say we need more oil and gas expansion and less regulation on emissions because Canadians have an affordability crisis is absolutely hypocritical, because it was that industry that was the biggest single cause of it. And we've seen the expensive ads, the television ads that show a poor family walking backwards in the grocery store, putting groceries back on the shelf because they can't afford it, or a shrunken bag of groceries, which is all we can afford if we don't let the oil and gas industry do its thing, or family holidays that were canceled because of the carbon tax, et cetera, et cetera. And this is their attempt to divert Canadians' legitimate concern and fear and anger into a very, very negative direction. First task of our report was to explain how oil prices are set, because there's often a kind of a pap attitude that, well, if the oil price went up, it's just supply and demand, or it was a supply issue, or it was a shortage. And none of those things actually happen. The price of oil in the world market is not set on an oil market. It is set in a financial market, a thing called the oil futures exchanges, where they actually trade pieces of paper. They don't trade physical barrels of oil. Pieces of paper that commit somebody to delivering a certain quantity of oil sometime in the future. It could be next month. It could be 3 years from now. Those futures markets set the price that is then the benchmark for key varieties of crude oil, like the West Texas Intermediate, the one in North America, or Brent crude, the one in Europe. And then other prices of oil are set in relation to that, depending on quality and location and access to refining capacity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this regard, the futures markets are very much like the foreign exchange market or the stock market or derivatives markets or options. They are, in a way, very fleeting and very speculative financialized assets that people are buying, not because they actually expect to take delivery of some oil. Only 1% of all the contracts traded on these markets actually result in somebody taking the delivery of oil. The other 99% is all people placing bets on whether the price of oil is going to go up or whether it's going to go down. And these markets are dominated by financial investors and traders. The rise of futures trading parallels the other dimensions of financialization that we've seen in the world economy over the last generation, including the use of borrowed money to place those bets, trading on margin, as it's called, which can amplify the profits if you made the right bet, but also amplify the vulnerability and instability if you made the wrong bet, because now it's not just you who lost your shirt, it's the banks that lent you the money who lost their shirt. And because of this speculative, over-exaggerated casino, in essence, prices for oil on these markets shoot up and shoot down far, far more dramatically than you would ever expect on the basis of real economic forces. So for every barrel of oil that's produced anywhere in the world, it trades hands 13 or 14 times on those paper markets. And those speculative bets dwarf any changes, any adjustments in world supply or world demand. Now, why do the paper markets start rushing in one way? Why does the herd suddenly start running in one direction? Usually there's something that's a bit of a spark for it. In 2020, obviously, it was the pandemic and a decline in world oil demand that sent the price crashing. In fact, for a while, the price was negative. The price of oil was negative in 2020 for a short time because of the over-exaggerated response of the futures markets. In 2022, it was the impending invasion of Ukraine and then the actual invasion of Ukraine that raised some fears about world oil supply. And that sent the whole herd rushing in the other direction. And the price shot up to $130 US a barrel. It turned out that there was no shortage of oil. There never was. And similarly, even in the pandemic, the decline in world oil demand, as environmentalists are painfully aware, was pretty modest. Only about 9% was the reduction in demand. So it didn't explain, it didn't justify that dramatic price collapse that actually made things worse down the road. And the invasion of Ukraine didn't justify this humongous surge in prices that then sparked a huge global inflationary cycle, including in Canada. So the prices are not a rational, efficient response to supply and demand. World oil supply continued to grow right through the whole Ukraine invasion. And it is this decision that we've made. It isn't natural. It isn't inevitable. A decision we've made to allow financial speculators to set the price for one of the most fundamental prices in our economy that explains why we are so vulnerable. And there's big money to be made in those paper markets. So the expansion of profits, speculative profits on the oil trading just took off after the pandemic and the reopening of the economy and the Ukraine invasion. You saw literally hundreds of billions of dollars of profits being made, first by the traders and speculators themselves. It didn't have anything to do, again, with the production and use of actual physical oil. Then the profits, of course, were captured by the oil industry because they could take advantage of those artificially high prices to jack up their own profits. And the irony is there was no supply shock. There's a couple of euphemisms that you often hear. Most economists, I think even mainstream ones, would agree that so-called energy prices were the main factor in the upsurge of inflation. But energy prices is the wrong word. It wasn't all energy prices. It was fossil fuel prices. The price of electricity in Canada, which is, first of all, more regulated, and secondly, many utilities are publicly owned. And third, most of our electricity in Canada comes from renewable sources, including hydro, not from fossil fuels. So electricity prices were a non-issue. They just increased at the same pace as overall consumer prices in all provinces except one, Alberta. Alberta has got a bizarre marketized system for setting the electricity price, and their price is shooting up and shooting down almost like one of these futures markets. But in the rest of the country, electricity was reliable, stable, and more or less affordable. The story was fossil fuel prices. Secondly, the economists often refer to a supply shock. It was a supply shock, and it wasn't a supply shock. It was a financial speculative shock, which is different. So we see that in the period, the 6 months around the invasion, Russian oil supply did decline a bit, not very much. They're still getting their oil out, and in fact, it recovered very quickly. But that was more than offset by an increase in oil supply from other non-OPEC countries in the world, and an increase in oil supply from OPEC. So it more than offset the impact of the war on Russian oil supply, and total world oil supply grew through this period and is still growing. There's no shortage of oil globally or in Canada, of course. We've produced more oil than ever. So there's no rational economic reason for why the oil price shot up so high, but despite that, it flowed directly through into the prices that Canadians pay for everything, not just fossil fuels. Of course, the most immediate impact is on the price of gasoline. The price of gasoline in Canada always shoots up the same day as the world oil price does. Tell me why. The gasoline in that pump was refined weeks ago from oil produced months ago here in Canada, not in the Persian Gulf. So why is it that we instantly pay more? But when the oil price comes down, you may have noticed this, it takes a long time for the gasoline price to come back down. So that tells you there's something fishy going on. In this period, around that oil price shock, fossil fuel prices in Canada shot up very quickly, and they explained alone the prices of gasoline, natural gas, fuel oil, and related products. 43% of all the growth in consumer prices in Canada, even though they only make up about 5% of total consumer spending. The prices increased so much, it pulled up the overall inflation rate dramatically. And that's just the direct cost for consumers buying those fossil fuels directly. There are other indirect costs that we went through and measured, all relative to the pre-pandemic situation. So we said if the pandemic hadn't occurred and all of the chaos, including the war in Ukraine, where would we be at in terms of all of these impacts? And it will be dramatic. This shows the year-over-year inflation in fossil fuel prices in Canada. The black line is the input prices that are paid by businesses who use fossil fuels in their own operations. They actually buy more than consumers do. The gray line shows the consumer prices for the things that consumers buy directly. Both of them surged for business inputs by 100% inflation, for consumers as much as 50% year-over-year inflation. And that clearly pulled up the overall inflation rate. The red line shows the overall inflation rate in Canada, which went from around 1 or 2% at the beginning of 2021. It peaked at 8% in June 2022, and then it started to decline. Why did it go up? Because fossil fuel prices went up. Why did it come down? Because fossil fuel prices came down. Because there was no real reason for that price spike. So it lasted about 6 months, and then the price came down. But by then, the whole cycle of inflation had started. Our report goes through and adds up what this costs Canadians in 4 different buckets, if you like. The first and most obvious is paying more for stuff that consumers buy directly: gasoline, natural gas, heating oil, and so on. Secondly, even more important, the prices of everything else consumers buy are affected by the fact that the businesses that produce those things, whether it's food or transportation services or construction or anything else, the businesses that produce those things had to pay more for their fossil fuel inputs. And of course, those costs were passed on to consumers. This is called the indirect effect. Third, what happened when the price shot up? to $130 a barrel and inflation peaked at 8%, the Bank of Canada jumped into the picture and said, we can't tolerate this. And that was when they started their big increases in interest rates. Within days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the price shooting up to $130, the Bank of Canada launched its first of 10 interest rate increases. And that wasn't solely due to the oil price, but it was a major, major factor. And our analysis shows about 35% of the increased sustained inflation that the bank was responding to with high interest rates was due to the oil price shock, at least. Then what happened when interest rates shot up? It was one of the most aggressive monetary tightening experiences in Canada's history. Well, the economy slowed down. That's the point. That's what the bank is trying to do. Slow down the economy, slow down job creation. So there were fewer people relative to the population employed and less income from wages and salaries. So these are all of the direct and indirect ways that the impact of the oil price shock was felt. And we went through and put numbers on all of them. This is why I say I'm never happier than when I'm buried in a spreadsheet. And boy, were there some great spreadsheets in this research. This shows the direct impact on consumer costs from the higher fossil fuel prices, mostly for gasoline, because that's the biggest purchase, but also natural gas and others, peaked at close to $8 billion in spring of 2022. This is the indirect cost experienced through business input prices that were passed on to consumers. This is the extra interest expenses paid by Canadians. They peaked in early 2024 at $12 billion in the spring quarter. And this is the lost employment income because the labor market was hammered by high interest rates, which were imposed because of high fossil fuel prices. So one chain leads to another in this whole snowball type of effect. And when you add it up, you get a honking big number across those four categories of costs, direct and indirect for consumers, almost $200 billion over a 3-year period. 2022, the year the price shock happened, and then the next 2 years as we adjusted to it. So $200 billion works out to $12,000 per household. So if you wonder why households are hard pressed, think about what they could have done with $12,000 extra over the last 3 years. They could have bought a lot of groceries. They could have eaten out in restaurants. They could have taken a vacation. They could have paid for things their family needs. And if you want to know why affordability became an issue, this is the biggest single reason. There's no other factor, not food, not shelter, not transportation directly. But the fossil fuel price spike was the biggest single thing that set this whole off. So then we follow the money. Just the first two of those four buckets, okay? The first two was the direct expenses consumers paid, and the second was the indirect expenses that businesses paid. Those both consist of money that was paid for fossil fuels. And guess where it ended up? It ended up in operating profits for the oil and gas industry. Almost a dollar for dollar relationship. It's not perfect. There are other things that happen. There are royalties that are collected, not enough, but there are some that are connected, and taxes paid, not enough, but some collected. But virtually all of the money that consumers paid extra because of this was reflected in increased profits for the oil and gas sector. And in 2022, they earned their highest profits ever. And compared to the pre-pandemic period, compared to 2019, oil and gas industry profits in Canada grew 1,000%. 1,000%. That's not a mistake. Not an extra zero on there. 1,000%. So we've been rightfully pissed off at Loblaws and Galen Weston and his annoying cardigan sweaters and how the food chains have profited from this inflation. And we should be. They did profit from it. We should be mad. We should be about 16 times more mad at the oil and gas sector because their profit growth through all of this was even worse. This is not just a historical exercise because it will happen again. There's been several price spikes and several price collapses in the world oil prices since this futures market trading system began in the 1980s. And with this guy out there with his tariffs and his cozying up to Putin and his, heightening tensions in the Middle East, we're going to have this happen again. And unless we prepare ourselves, we'll go through the whole exercise of rising prices, rising inflation, rising interest rates to fight the rising inflation, and lost employment, income, and so on. So we identified 3 key responses that we should do. First of all, we should try to break or at least mute that link between the hyper sensitive roller coaster on oil futures markets and the prices that we actually pay for this stuff here in Canada. And there are ways to do that. We used to regulate prices in Canada so that it was a Canadian price that reflected Canadian cost of production and Canadian market conditions. We could do that again, or we could do other partial measures such as circuit breakers and limits on how much oil prices and fossil fuel prices can fluctuate within a certain period of time, or regulate some of the other aspects of the fossil fuel system. We do that to some extent. Electricity prices, as I mentioned, carefully regulated, and they didn't surge. Natural gas prices, we don't regulate the price of the gas, but we do regulate the pipeline charges and the distribution charges. So natural gas prices did not increase nearly as much as other fossil fuel prices. So there are options here. Secondly, if the oil price spike does occur anyways, then what we have to do is claw back some of the excess profits that were captured, either through stronger provincial royalty payments and or through excess profits taxes on those companies, and redistribute the money back to Canadians who paid for it. We did this with the banks and the insurance companies after the pandemic. The government implemented a targeted excess profits tax because they did so well while Canadians were in crisis. Exactly the same logic applies here. Finally, the best way to protect ourselves against fossil fuel price spikes is to stop using so much fossil fuels with accelerating energy conservation and accelerating the energy transition. And again, this is where the AstroTurf messaging of the oil and gas industry is turning the world upside down. For them to come out and say we have to get rid of climate policies and regulations on emissions because Canadians care about affordability, absolutely wrong. They're the reasons that affordability has been a problem in the last 3 years, and reinforcing our reliance on fossil fuels will absolutely set us up for another affordability crisis in a very, very short period of time. So that's my summary, Amber. Thank you very much again for partnering on this, and I look forward to seeing where Louise goes with this because she knows how to message all of this in our continuing fight. Thank you.
Super. I'm just going to make sure I went into a little panic because my headset stopped working. You can hear me? Yay. Okay. I'm sharing my screen. And just as I do that, I'm going to minimize this panel. Give me 1 sec here. Hide video panel. And I am going to talk to you and really leap from where Jim started or ended in terms of there it is, meeting controls. Perfect. I got rid of everything. Where Jim left off in terms of how do we actually make the move from the unaffordable to the affordable, and what pitfalls might we be exposing ourselves to as we are thinking about how to do that. It won't surprise you that just like Jim, I happen to be a bit of a geek when it comes to my spreadsheets and Excels and my statistical software, and it makes me very happy too. And I'm very fortunate at Re.Climate to be able to do some of that research. And, you know, we really are involved in action research, which tries to solve real problems in real time. And I've been running a survey for the last 3 years where I've been looking at energy transition issues, particularly electrification, because that's really where the story is about where we want to go. I've measured things like how people perceive policies, climate policies, and efficient technologies that we promote in terms of the household level, how they perceive that from a fairness and acceptability point of view. And every year I test and look at new narratives. We'll talk about that in the Q&A. But this year we did a lot more on affordability. And the reason for that is, of course, unaffordability is top of mind. And we see that in the polls. Climate change and environment has been falling, you know, when you look at that list of top of mind concerns. And what was the natural thing that a lot of communicators and advocates did? We started to position climate solutions as improving affordability. So it's reasonable for a person like myself to ask whether or not affordability messages are effective. I'm going to give you 4 top lines, and then I'll tell you some of the results, and then I'll summarize it again. Let me tell you, affordability is about a lot more than money. Many people that we surveyed and spoke to in focus groups feel they have no choice and that only the wealthy can afford to participate in the energy transition. Reliability is a growing concern. We tend to talk about affordability, but at this time, in certain segments, we see a real growth in reliability concerns, and it is a barrier to acceptance of a transition to a renewable energy system. At a household level, we're suggesting we really also want to think about things like comfort and safety and security, not just money. People have really low confidence levels. Misinformation is fueling skepticism. There's no doubt about it. They doubt that the tech works, whether that's at a system level or at a household level. They even doubt that incentives make any difference at all. And we really found that there's a need, if we're going to engage the public, they have to personally experience it. So we are interested in system level pieces. Jim talked about it at the most global scale and how it affects us in Canada. But people aren't systems thinkers, nor are they involved in the energy system day to day. So we have to ask them questions about things they do understand, like their ability to participate in that transition, whether it's through heat pumps, or EVs and so on. They really not just have difficulties around the tech, but they have difficulties around the process. So let's talk about affordability, and I'll show you some numbers, and I won't keep you too long on the numbers side. You've got 3 boxes here. Those 3 boxes really matter because they matter from the perspective of the people who completed the survey, meaning these ideas collected together for them. They were conceptually the same. The top bar is what I would call the negative emotions and very weak efficacy that we saw in the survey results. And this comes right out of focus groups. I heard these arguments in focus groups and I thought, this can't be true. Really, would Canadians at high levels really also agree about these ideas? And we were having conversations at that time about heat pumps and electric vehicles. And these are the things that came out. And that top row shows that these ideas, if you think one thing, you also think the others, that only the wealthy can afford. Almost a quarter of the 4 in 10 people think that's true. A third are angry about feeling pressured into buying these technologies. 20% feel judged by elites who flaunt these technologies, and 17% just say they're not reliable, they're a passing fad. So if you think one, you kind of think all of those things, and that matters to the overall results. On the bottom right, we've got almost 4 in 10 who say they would invest if they had help. But a good portion of those people also feel angry that they can't afford. So you see, again, these emotions, you could call them negative emotions. You're going to see, I'm going to lead you as we go through this into this idea that people are really feeling a lot of what we're talking about and encouraging them to think about they feel is unfair. On the left side, you're seeing 2 items. They stand separate from each other, but are really important. Almost half of those survey respondents said they have no choice but to use their existing vehicle and furnace, regardless of the effect on the environment. And a very small component of the sample said they already have the EVs or heat pumps, and they already save them money. And those people tell us a lot about how to communicate and engage. We also asked people what was their #1 priority when it comes to electricity. As Jim says, we want to transition. We want to have an electrified energy system. Wouldn't surprise you that affordability is the top priority for almost half, and there's no change in that number from 2024. I've done this survey over time. 39% say that reliability is the #1 priority for them, and that is increasing. And what's important about that is that it really is an issue, #1 issue for people over 65, for people who live in Quebec, and also people who are more progressive, who are concerned about affordability, but just as concerned about reliability. On the sad side, for those of us who have an environmental values orientation, is that environmental sustainability was always low, but it's down 7%. It's down to 10%. You know, we know that that's what's going on, which is why we've been jumping to affordability messaging. Won't surprise you to hear me say as we go through this that I'm going to suggest a focus as well on reliability. For the folks in the survey who said that they were concerned about affordability as their #1 priority, we asked them whether or not they thought incentives make upgrades in terms of their home. Remember, I'm trying to connect with people in terms of their personal reference points, do incentives actually make the tech more affordable? And again, I was stunned by the results. On the left side, you'll see that only 6% say that incentives make it much more affordable. It's only 15% saying more affordable, and that's down 3% from last year. Thinking that incentives don't make the technologies more affordable is up 5% from last year. And thinking that it's somewhat more affordable is down 2%. So we really aren't connecting. You've got 64% of folks saying, you know, I'm not convinced that these incentives are really going to cut it for me in terms of getting me over the hump. So let me transition into some discussion of fairness. When we're thinking about a policy, when we're reacting to it, you saw me reference these angry emotions. What's often happening is we're actually getting a sense of what people think is fair. And we often think of fairness as something that is just referencing to myself. And I can say to you that that is not true from a well-investigated set of evidence and research by social scientists looking at the question of fairness. And in this case, I'm talking about affordability. So I'm not even talking about the whole wonderful world of fairness. I'm only talking about what we'll call distributive fairness, which means, you know, what is X going to affect me? Will I be worse off personally? I'm looking at the third column. I'm going to not get into too much detail on the kinds of categories, but you can see there's an interpersonal. But you can also compare whether or not you will be worse off compared to others. But we also compare or worry about groups in our society. Will everybody be equally affected? Is the impact proportional to income? Is it proportional to the contribution to the problem? And that sits very nicely with the oil and gas sector. We can easily say they are not contributing proportional to their contribution. But we also, and turns out statistically, most importantly, want to know, does this thing X, whether it's a regulation or the thing you're asking me to do, does it actually work for me personally? But does it do what you said, which is protect the environment? Does it actually reduce emissions? And that piece of efficacy turns out to be super, super important. So those items, let me just show you again. On the third column, I gave you these items. I showed you these 6 or so items. Well, of course, there's a scale for that. And again, I'm showing you the results in 2 groups. Why am I doing that? Because the statistics showed that conceptually, the unfairness items went together and the fairness items went together. So let me just share for you, when it comes to affordability, you would have thought, and it's not to say that it's not important, my financial situation will get worse. 36% said that, and 34% in 2024, up a little bit from in 2023. I will be worse off compared to others. You can see that. That's an interpersonal, it's 26%. But more than any, and this holds across the years, people are concerned about the effect on people with low incomes, that low income households will be more harmed, if you will, by, in this case, the switch to electrification than high income people. So let's just keep that there. On the right are the fairness items. People who consume the most electricity are affected the most. Nature and the environment will be protected. Everybody will be affected the same. And on balance, if you add all this up, we tend to perceive, in this case, electrification and clean electricity regulation as a little bit more unfair than fair. But we are seeing some improvement. I see some jumps from last year in terms of fairness, even though we still had a bit of a jump in unfairness. So again, remember that we've got angry people, not a lot of agency and efficacy, and not a lot of fairness going on. So how does it all fit together? This is my attempt to show it to you in as simple a way as I could, but this is statistically tight. If you are a person who let's just go to the middle, to the left of the circle, positive technology evaluations, that you reacted to my questions around heat pumps and EVs and electrification and the clean electricity regulation, you were down for that. You were a person who thought the incentives help. It tends to be a person also who says that I won't be worse off. You are also a person who says that nature will be protected. And you believe that the transition is fair and acceptable. What you want is to build agency and efficacy because that increases fairness perceptions. All the people on the right who had the more negative evaluations had very low agency, low efficacy, and perceived what we're talking about as unfair. And the numbers are kind of high. If you look at my sample, about 44% of the sample was in the right and about 56% in the left. So we really want to do better at what we're doing. So let me get into my top line recommendations. I say it, I think, in every webinar that we do. All of our work, all of our communications, all of our advocacy should be aimed at trying to build both personal and collective agency, personal and collective efficacy. We need to increase the perception that what we are talking about is fair. And that unfairness perception is what killed the carbon tax, for example. How do we build agency? Well, we have to accept that dollars and cents messaging is not enough on its own to increase uptake or support for climate change solutions. We need to build stories that say, we can do this. And so importantly, stories about we are making progress. I tested a narrative on this. It is the most effective message. People need to know that the effort is worth it. And we don't spend enough time helping people see that the effort is worth it. We are making progress. We've got to build efficacy. There's so much misinformation about what we're trying to promote. We need to show that I and we can do this effectively, that solution X works. And importantly, how people accessed it and why it works for the average Canadian. When we got into the affordability story and the money, we forgot, I think, to do something super important that this research really emphasizes for me and personally. And that is that we have to remind people and front load the fact that what we're doing is for nature and future generations, that it does effectively reduce emissions and help us be safer from a climate change point of view, and that it's reliable. Don't be afraid to talk about comfort and safety and security. And that's particularly true for women. I mentioned that, I'm just going to pull this out so I can give it to you. You know, there's always demographic aspects to all of our research, but the statistics really show the key factors that I'm highlighting are really the things that are driving the results. But having said that, what's really important is that in getting through this story and getting through this piece on fairness, what I've seen is that rural communities, conservatives, and women are really being excluded from many of the stories that we're telling. In fact, I'd even add a little bit to this to say that most of what we're doing is engaging higher income, higher educated people, particularly males. I see that in the data. And so we do need to attend to these other issues, these other segments, and to people's emotional needs, not just the rational mind and the technology and how great it is. We need to tell stories that resonate, and in particular with lower income and less educated households. They are open, they want to be included, but they're feeling that they really can't get in. We also have to educate. We tested whether people understood what the primary cause of fossil fuels are, and only 49% correctly identified fossil fuels like oil, coal, and gas as the primary cause of climate change. Every piece of communication, insert it every time, everything. On framing, here's something that just to kind of take away because of who we are. Progressive activists, those of us who are more engaged, more concerned about climate change, that 21% or 17% of the population, they're ready for affordability messaging, what's called gain-framed messaging, making our life more affordable. That is most suited to engaged audiences. But that is not enough of the population. Unaffordability is what we have to highlight for people who are less engaged, the loss-framed messaging, the culpability and corruption that Jim highlighted, the risk of higher bills, those kinds of things. You have to articulate in your own mind, who's my audience, which ones are best suited. A generic affordability messaging is not coming through, nor is it being believed. And then finally, to end with this just kind of piece, I talked about that 15% of the respondents who had an EV and a heat pump, and they were saying they saved them money. those folks are really our ambassadors. When people have experience, and it could be with heat pumps and EVs, it could be with community-based renewable energy, it could be that they are a worker, whatever it is that gives that ability to bring an ambassador forward, to tell a story about the transition that we're talking about, whether systems level, community level, or household level, we've got to do it. Because it's not just about the tech. People want to know, how does it work? How does it affect my life? What was the process like? How did you access incentives? What is it like for me, you, our community, and our country? And in other words, to say, it's the process that matters. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Louise. Thank you, Jim. Jim, despite your in feeling like your slides were maybe too economic, there was a lot of chit chat in the chat over there asking people want to know if they can have it. They want to. There was a lot, we need to get this information out, right away. Why isn't this, headlines, et cetera.
Didn't anyone say they want to come over Friday night and go through all the spreadsheets with me?
I do.
Okay, we're on.
Be careful what you ask for. So thank you both. And we have about 25 minutes. I have a couple of questions. We often ask people when they register, what is it that you'd like us to cover? So we have a few questions that came in advance, and then we have some questions that are coming up in the Q&A now. I want to reassure everybody, we will send you the slides. You will have them. The benefit of this is all in the interest of the public good. Use them as you like, and please help us to get the story out there. I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid, to be honest, and I'm going to ask you a question for both of you that I think is top of mind. Yesterday, there was a letter that 14 CEOs of the largest oil and gas companies and pipeline companies wrote. It was an open letter to the political leaders, calling for a national, for this moment to be called a national energy crisis. They described in the letter as a so-called how-to guide, asking for less regulation to speed up key projects in the national interest. And they cited a shifting public mood and an awakening and more balance in the conversation around affordability, reliability, and sustainability. So I feel like this does a good job of bringing together both, I think, the research that you've done, Jim, as well as your sense of where the public mood is, Louise, and how we might, how communicators and leaders might address this moment. So I'll go to you, Jim, first. So the question is based on your research, what do you think is a response in this moment to this call for an energy crisis and less regulation, more investment in fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, now the oil and gas industry is trying to weaponize something else instead of trying to weaponize the affordability concerns, which have been dominant until now. And so they've identified that the threat of Trump and his attacks on Canada and other places in the world gives them an opening to try and advance their arguments again for deregulation of climate. First of all, it's not an accident. They called for the emissions cap to be eliminated. Getting rid of the carbon price was just the first step, obviously, and it's whet their appetite. They will not be happy until all regulations and limits on their production and emissions are gone. And now they're trying to use the economic fear that Canadians are experiencing. What will happen to our economy if we get hit by Trump's tariffs? And it will be serious. It will be a recession, no doubt about it. So they're saying, therefore, we need the jobs and investment that will come from building out fossil fuel infrastructure all the more. They'll also try to make an argument that pipelines to the coast will mean we're less dependent on selling our energy to America. And that's a weak argument, because even with TMX now open, most of the oil there still goes to America. And at any rate, it's oil is a fungible commodity. So, it doesn't ultimately really matter where our oil gets sold. And we don't know what's going to happen to world oil prices if Trump goes ahead with all of this. We could very much see a collapse in them again if oil futures markets react to the prospect of a global recession from all of this instability. So I think the best response here is going to be to say we want to build a stronger, more independent Canadian economy, and there are much more effective and sustainable ways to do that. I've been, in my commentary about the Trump stuff, I've been trying to emphasize east-west links, including in renewable energy. What about an east-west electricity grid? That one has a lot more jobs involved in it than building a pipeline. It would also reinforce the energy transition, because the more you're connected across provinces, the more you can offset the natural fluctuations in supply that come with wind and solar power. So they are going to try and play the jobs card with this one. And because Canadians are rightfully fearful of their jobs, it's going to have some resonance. And this is where we'll have to be ready with, I think, a strong counter argument to show that there are much better and sustainable ways to build an independent Canadian economy where everyone's employed.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, Louise.
Yeah, well, let's just start from the ethics. I mean, it is despicable what they've done and what they are doing. Partly, I say that because, of course, much of what they're saying simply isn't true. It's critically important that we correct misinformation at every turn. Liquefied natural gas is not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally because of the life cycle issues. The industrial carbon pricing system actually incents investment and innovation. It is not costing, as the Climate Institute says, anything more than a Timbit per barrel. So it is outrageous, and we need to call out the companies for not just the collusion and corruption that Jim talked about, but this kind of effort that they make. And I say it because I think it will be effective. It is effective. These companies are not trusted. The issue for the public, as I understand it, is that they want companies to do their fair share. Won't surprise you that I would say that, but I've confirmed that in a lot of research, and that they want polluters to be held accountable. And so in many ways, this comes to a question of government culpability. Governments falling for the lies and using it as an excuse to dismantle the progress that we have made. It's really fundamental in this election, which we know will be called Sunday, that we fight for the progress that's been made and to strengthen it. This is not about a fight over what we keep, what we don't lose. This is about keeping everything and strengthening what we've got. And so that issue of losing progress is critical. And then finally, to say, just because climate change has fallen down the list of top of mind issues, don't think that the public doesn't care about climate. As DSF showed just recently with the Leger poll, 70%, 65% of Canadians remain concerned about climate change. Their attention is focused on their near-term security issues, but climate change can explode to the front in a moment, and they expect their politicians to do what needs to be done on climate. They won't get away with not doing it. We shouldn't be shy about calling out companies and politicians on this regard in the next few weeks.
Thank you. I'm going to address one more question, and I think we've got quite a few that are coming in at the moment. It feels like this is wrapped up in this sort of trap where we have climate versus affordability. And I'm just curious, Louise, just to be clear, how would you recommend that we frame in that? What is the communications approach, and how do we get out of this and move beyond the climate versus affordability debate?
Great question. So I'm going to show you two things, or I cite a couple of things that really matter. Because of course they support the research that we've all been doing. And so when multiple researchers say the same things, I always feel we have a more robust result. Positive Energy just put out some research last week that is backing up the point I'm going to make. Go in through the front door on climate change. Stop jumping. Oh, people are worried about affordability. We'll leap to affordability. That'll work. No, the issue is climate change. go through the front door and potential energy is very clear about that. Go through the front door on climate change. It is the issues and concerns and the risks associated with climate change that get people's attention. And always it's about the things that we love, future generations, protecting and reducing risks. The other aspects, when I mentioned the question of unaffordability versus affordability, I would actually argue that, it's a small crew that's ready for the affordability message, as I mentioned. It turns out the public is right. It is unaffordable to get into a lot of these technologies. The incentives don't cover all of the upfront costs. We do have to make our programs better. And so there are losses that we risk from climate change itself. That's a loss frame. And there are losses that we face from not being able to reduce the amount of energy that we use. And we need programs to make it easier for people to access this. So let's not disregard the fact when somebody says only the wealthy can afford. When I look at the stats, it's true. High educated, over 120,000 a year. Those are the people that were the ones in the sample that had the tech.
Thank you. Jim, what's your thought? How do we get out of this climate affordability trap and debate?
Well, I mean, the approach we've taken with this project is to show how fossil fuel reliance has contributed to the affordability problems and try to neutralize that card that the oil and gas sector is trying to play. And warn that it will happen again in the future. This, I think, comes in with the carbon price decision that Carney's made as well. In theory, we will see a one-time reduction in fossil fuel prices for consumers when the carbon price comes off. In practice, I'm not sure. For example, the carbon price is already off home heating oil, and there was no big reduction in the price to consumers. So, I'd be really surprised if on April 1st we suddenly see a 17-cent reduction in gasoline prices across the country, which again tells you something. That's the rocket versus feather theory of inflation. When the costs are going up, the prices shoot up like a rocket. When costs are going down, prices might kind of gradually float down like a feather. But that is not going to prevent the next oil price spike. That's the point. The Americans experienced the same thing as we did, and they don't have a carbon price. So, I think in that regard, my focus anyway has not been on highlighting the affordability of these new renewable energy systems, EVs and heat pumps and so on. Lots of people are doing that. My focus has been on the macroeconomic level to show the dangers to macroeconomic stability and living standards from continued reliance on a roller coaster that has no economic, rhyme or reason to it.
Awesome. I feel like there's a recipe here. There's a two-part. One, you need to have put the blame where it needs to be, and you need to better communicate and actually make things more clear, more reliable, more effective, and have people who have expertise and experience actually showing their experience with it. I'm going to go to a few questions here individually. So for you, Jim, we have an anonymous question, and I feel like it was also in the chat. Why has it taken 3 years for these facts to come to light, and why is there so little reporting on this?
Oh, I wish I had a good answer for that. I mean, I have been beating the drum for 3 years about the role of corporate power and corporate profits in explaining that whole inflationary surge. So we've done a lot of research through our center here in Canada and internationally about what I call profit-led inflation, how companies took advantage of the disruptions of the pandemic. In some cases, there were genuine shortages, not oil, but semiconductors, new automobiles, building products, those things actually were in short supply during and immediately after the consumer lockdown or the health lockdowns. And that was part of the problem. So just because something's in short supply, though, does that mean the price has to shoot up? Only if you accept that it's a God-given right for a company to take advantage of a crisis and charge whatever the market will bear. And the analogy I used was, imagine a plane crash. Here I am with the plane crash analogy again. What is it with me and planes? A plane crashes in the desert. The survivors walk out. They're dying of thirst, and there's somebody selling bottles of water for $100 a liter. Is that supply and demand, or is that extortion? And we had a lot of extortion by the corporate sector during the post-pandemic inflation. A lot of anger directed, as I mentioned, at the supermarkets, and rightfully so. But frankly, the profits, the excess profits the supermarkets took, and they did take some, their profits doubled. But that was small potatoes, to use a grocery analogy, Amber, of small potatoes compared to what the oil and gas industry was sucking in. And there was no more economic justification for what they were doing than what we were. Now, against that, of course, we had to fight against the power of corporations over our narratives and over our thinking and over our research. So, you know, I was attacked, and others making this argument were attacked by all these big business groups saying we are economically literate. We didn't know what we were talking about. Companies are just passing on higher costs. And that absolutely was not true. But, you know, as with everything else in society, when you challenge power, you're going to have a fight. And the other side has more weapons and more money than we do. So we will keep pushing. But we've certainly been trying to make this argument. And I've been arguing, you know, for 3 years straight that the fossil fuel industry was the biggest culprit in this. There's lots of culprits to go around, but fossil fuel was the biggest one. And that was part of the rationale to do this deeper dive in this report, to have a bit more evidence to show exactly how much that has been true.
Thank you. This question is for you, Louise, again, from Anonymous. Can you talk about the connection of this work, the 5 Canada's work, and communication? Also wondering about the framing around the determinants of health. So a question here about how do we layer on, I think, your insights around affordability and communicating, and the 5 Canada's segmentation work that was released with Eco Analytics earlier or last year.
Yep. If you actually, maybe we could put the link in again to the 5 Canada's work. You'll see very clearly there that what I'm showing you here is that the affordability messaging so far is really for the progressive activist. It's for us. We're talking to ourselves when we're doing a lot of that messaging. For the rest of the population, and that would include civic nationals in particular, centrist liberals and so on, we really need to do more on the unaffordability side, remembering that, or at least my assessment of what we see here is that incentives still aren't working for those folks who tend to be lower income, who tend to be more working class, because they may not have the cash in the bank to put in their bit, and they're heavily discounting the future savings against those current expenditures. And so for that group, we need not just communication. We do need better communication. We need to help them understand why they risk their bills going up as opposed to the savings. It's that shift from gain framing to loss framing is part of it. But we also need to reform programs and have more concierge services and more, much more expanded and robust programs for lower to moderate income households. I just want to comment on one of the things that flew by around, you know, whether we target individuals or the system. And I just want to say, let's, if we can, try not to make that dichotomous argument. The reality is that people support policy and the transition that we're talking about in terms of renewable energy when they have some familiarity with what we're talking about. And so, in fact, households that have experience with whether it's an EV or a heat pump or solar panels or whatever are much more supportive of the broader system change. For the people who have none of that in their homes and they have concerns about unaffordability, you also need to help them believe and understand it's going to be reliable. But I find I've, you know, over 10, 15, 20, 25 years of focus groups, it is very difficult to have a conversation with people about the energy system because that's not where they live. And so it's not an issue of blaming individuals or putting the pressure on households. It's about building agency and efficacy at the collective level, as well as helping them participate and drive the change, right? Doing these things help drive the change. We're not going to have an electric transportation system without people either taking electrified public transit or having an electric vehicle. It's just, they go together.
Thank you. And maybe just a quick follow-up, quick. There's a question here from Annie Berube. Would the survey responses, in your opinion, Louise, be different if we had offered different options other than expensive heat pumps and EVs?
Yeah, so maybe, this comes, the questions in the survey came out of my, my 13 focus groups though, Annie. And in those focus groups, we were talking about the whole thing, like, you know, what have you done? What might you be into? And so, you know, we're trying to get people to talk about whether or not they see the opportunities for the energy system to change and whether they see their household as participating in that. It could have been a little bit torqued with the more expensive stuff, but these were folks that weren't going to spend dollars primarily, right? Primarily, whether it's going to be for windows or efficiency, insulation, or whatever. But yeah, that's a good point to always be thinking about. I was stunned from the focus group transition to the survey to get such high numbers in terms of how people reacted to thinking these incentives and programs aren't really accessible to them. And I think that's a bigger issue, regardless of whether we were talking about EVs or heat pumps.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Jim, I'm going to ask one last question to you, and then we'll start to sum up so that we can get people back to their day to start sharing this information within their networks. So I have kind of two parts. There's one here. Pierre Polyev says that Canada has been selling all its oil and gas to the US at discounted rates. Is this true? And how does this work with regard to market-based oil and gas prices? And I'm going to squeeze in something else, and I'm not even sure if it makes sense to do that. But there's a second question here: is another way for the government of Canada to bring the price of Canadian oil in line with reality? Is there another way for the government of Canada to bring the price of Canadian oil in line with reality as opposed to speculative markets? So you're smart. I think you'll be able to weave to those things together.
Oh, thank you. Those are both great questions. On the Canadian oil selling at a discount, there's some material in the full report about that. It is true, it certainly does sell at a discount. A typical barrel of Canadian oil sold at Cushing, Oklahoma. Don't ask me why it all goes to Cushing, Oklahoma, but it does, where these transshipment points are, sells for anywhere between $15 and $30 a barrel less than the West Texas Intermediate, which is the benchmark crude that is used as one of the major price benchmarks in the overall system. Various reasons for that. One of them is the quality of the Canadian crude is lower. It's heavier oil, more sulfur. And of course, when it comes from bitumen, it's got all these chemicals in to dilute it. Also, transportation issues. Also, refining capacity is a big problem for Canadian oil because it is that heavier crude, and only some refineries can use it. So some of that is inherent. The thing the oil and gas industry always stresses is because all of the pipelines, with the exception of the TMX now, the oil pipelines go south, we're kind of captive to that market. And I think it's debatable whether that really affects the price or not, because as I said, oil is a fungible commodity and it goes all over the world. You have seen some narrowing of the price differential since TMX opened. Most of the oil that goes through TMX is still going to the United States. It's just going to different parts of the United States. What could Canada do? Or in aggregate, by the way, that discount on the Canadian oil is worth about $15 to $20 billion a year for the Americans. So that is, you know how Trump stands up and says they're subsidizing us? He's got it backwards. And we've done research on all the ways Canada subsidizes them, and this is one of them. In terms of setting more rational prices in Canada, I think that is going to involve a big debate, because we used to do that in Canada until the 1980s in various ways. We had different national policies, including one, remember, that forced everyone west of the Ottawa Valley in Canada to buy Canadian oil, which was much more expensive then than it was coming from Saudi Arabia. And we did that as a form of direct subsidy to the oil industry to develop a Canadian oil industry. So every time the oil industry stands up and says we're free enterprise, they should get struck by lightning. That was one of the big subsidies. The subsidies for initial development of the bitumen projects, another huge public subsidy. So we've done that in the past. We had a big debate in the 1980s, and I'm old enough to remember it, when that was all thrown out and we went to the world oil price. And, I think there's a lot of misinformation about what the issues were back then. I would like to see a more rational and smoothed out process for setting fossil fuel prices, not to make them cheap per se, but to make them steady and reliable and rational. Including increasing them bit by bit over time, as was the idea with the carbon price. But rightly or wrongly, we lost the debate in the public about the carbon price. So this argument about how we will set the price in a more rational way, both in regards to economics and in regards to the environment, is going to be a tough challenge. But that being said, we can't ignore what we've done by tying the whole thing to this roller coaster over there and showing that it's not rational, it's not supply and demand, it's not inevitable, is, I think, helping to lay the groundwork for a renewed discussion in Canada about how we do set those prices.
Thank you. Well, our time is up, friends, and we are always committed to getting people back to their day. Thank you very, very much, Jim, for joining us. Thank you very, very much, Louise, for the work that you've done. Just a note to everybody, we will share the recording, we will share the presentations, we will publish a summary blog to help pull out some of the key points and key takeaways. As always, we do like to know and get your feedback on the work that we're doing. So we're going to pop into the chat a survey link, and I believe that it'll also pop up when you leave the webinar. Please take a moment to tell us and give us your feedback. And if you have any questions about what we do, about the webinar, about the training, and the services that we provide, you can reach out to our Director of Resources and Training, Gada, and she'll pop her email into the chat as well. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. There will be more coming. Re.Climate will be certainly publishing more and more advice around how we have this conversation. And thank you, everyone, and good luck.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Louise.
Bye.